From cooling off in Hungarian fountains to painting Austria's roads and car parks to reflect the sun, Europe's heat wave is prompting creative ways to try and beat the heat. But beyond the quirky coping strategies, soaring temperatures are exposing a lack of preparedness in many countries for a hotter climate. From stifling hospital wards in France to overheated care homes in Scandinavia. And in southern Europe, the heat is causing wildfires to tear through towns and livelihoods, leaving devastation and grief in its wake.
In Hungary, the current Europe-wide heat wave means playing in the fountain to cool down. While in Austria, it's led to an art gallery commissioning an artist to change the tarmac colour to reduce the heat reflection. But elsewhere, the heat is having more serious consequences. Countries not equipped for high temperatures are struggling to adapt. At this hospital in France, the sweltering heat is uncomfortable for patients and health workers alike. The building is poorly insulated, and it's almost the same heat on the ward as the outside temperature of 35 degrees. It's a similar story in the Nordic countries. An extended heat wave this year has meant time on the beach, but also exposed infrastructure not built for such climate change.
Buildings designed for keeping heat in and not out. In care facilities and homes, well-insulated but poorly ventilated buildings with limited active cooling meant indoor heat often exceeded safe limits. As a result, for example, 8 hospitals in Norway had to cancel surgeries.
In other parts of Europe, the heat is life-threatening, but in a different way. Wildfires. This is the devastation in Greece. The tragedy is written on the face of this man, who's lost his livelihood after his petrol station burned to the ground. In recent days, France and Spain have struggled to bring devastating and deadly blazes under control. Global warming and local catastrophes. Does Europe have to adapt more rapidly to a hot new world?
Let's get more on that from meteorologist Matthew Capucci. Welcome to the studio. Matt, you've been here on DW many times before, your first time here. Let's pick up on the last point in that report about the wildfires and the record-breaking temperatures. Is this Europe's new normal?
You know, I think we're seeing more of this thanks to climate change in large part. You know, 440,000 hectares have burned so far this year. That's 189,000 more than this point last year. So a much worse wildfire season. And of course, warmer temperatures really extremify the climate and make it more likely for wildfires like this to occur. You know, a warmer world is...
Sorry,
yes.
so the wildfires themselves build into this cycle?
Yeah, it's sort of all tied together. And so lately we've had something called a heat dome, a big sprawling ridge of high pressure with hot sinking air. And what happens is that with the air so incredibly warm, you can evaporate more moisture from the ground, basically desiccating the landscape, sapping the ground of moisture and making it more ripe to burn.
OK. And meteorologists like yourself, you're clear that the trend for temperatures is upwards. This isn't a blip.
Most definitely. You know, even though this year hasn't been the hottest, you know, June was the 5th warmest on record in Europe. July was the 4th warmest on record. We saw especially high temperatures across the Iberian Peninsula earlier on this summer, with 46-degree temperatures in both Portugal and Spain, setting monthly records, monthly all-time records in both of those countries. July incredibly hot too, and now August is fitting that pattern, especially across Central and Northern Europe. And, you know, summer is supposed to be hot, but these days we're tilting the scales a little bit towards the extreme hot side of things, with 2 times more heat records than the number of cold records we're setting. OK, and so, as I understand it, we are now on track to miss the climate goals set out in the Paris Climate Agreement. So does that mean that we are doomed, there is no turning back? I think that's a really good point you make, because so often when we talk about this question of thresholds, is there a certain magic threshold we have to meet that we're going to fall off a cliff after? And realistically, I try to emphasize to folks, it's not like this magical cliff. Instead, the atmosphere has what we call positive feedback mechanisms. If you nudge the atmosphere towards a really hot scenario, we sort of reinforce that through several different mechanisms. For example, you know, the hotter we get, the more we melt the polar ice caps. That means there's less white, shiny, reflective stuff to reflect away sunlight, and we're taking in more sunlight. Or, for example, as we heat the atmosphere holds more moisture, which in turn traps more heat. And so this, you know, the 2 degrees Celsius threshold set by many of these agreements isn't necessarily this firm thing. It just simply goes to show that the more we heat the Earth, the more the Earth is going to continue heating itself.
Right, but except that, the scientists will tell us we still have to keep everything down, which sounds like sense. But once you've gone through those thresholds, once those thresholds have been demonstrably broken, doesn't it damage their credibility? Because the naysayers turn around and say, well, look, you said 2 degrees, we're all still here.
I agree fully. Yeah, I think one very difficult thing is that you have scientists and you have communicators, and oftentimes you don't really have scientists who are talented communicators. And that's a huge issue these days. You know, people are really struggling to believe scientists or place faith in scientists, especially after the COVID pandemic. I try to emphasize to folks that there's no ideal, perfect climate. There's no good climate or bad climate. There will be winners of climate change. Russia, for example, might like the new climate. They'll have a much easier time with agriculture. But there will be disproportionately more losers with climate change because the infrastructure we've built is essentially attuned to a climate that no longer really exists. You know, only 19% of Europe has air conditioning, 90% of the United States does. That's a huge issue that Europe will have to face in the years ahead, and that's just one of many different vulnerabilities that Europe in particular will be facing.
And just on this notion of politics, let me see if I can draw you into that a little deeper, because we're used to here on DW to seeing you out in hurricanes and floods in the United States, where the climate obviously is changing. And I think that the argument here in Europe is pretty much settled. There are still some people who say, no, it's not a thing. But it seems to be so much more contentious in the US. How is that so? How are people still so reluctant to believe that this is happening there?
I think in the United States, we really struggle with science and scientific literacy, and especially when politicians, disproportionately in the United States, use science for personal gain or for the gain of their agenda. You know, it sort of intertwines science and politics, and those are things that shouldn't be intertwined. So much so in the United States, we have 2 vastly different camps in terms of climate. We have people who don't even believe that climate change is a thing, and we have what I call essentially climate hippies, who are sort of so doom and gloom that every weather event is blamed on climate change, and neither are appropriate scenarios. There needs to be a balanced, nuanced approach to climate discussions, climate topics, and that's something I've strived to do for years. You know, whenever we have a weather event in the United States that defies what's normal, typical, or average, I try to contextualize that within the realm of climate change. To what extent is climate change playing a role? And I found communicating climate through specific weather events is a way to sort of get people to enter the conversation. But in the United States, if you walk out sort of waving that climate flag, it immediately turns people off to what could be a productive dialogue.
OK. And you mentioned the fact that houses and cities are built now for climates that have changed. Are you seeing adaptation being made rapidly enough around the world? Is there anywhere that you would look at and say, well, look at them, they did it, they've done it well, look at them, they're still in the wrong century?
I think you make a really good point. You know, the issue isn't even that the climate's changing, it's that the climate is changing and the conditions are evolving faster than we're able to evolve our infrastructure. To me, that's the biggest concern. I think precipitation extremes are going to be a huge issue in the future, particularly with regard to either flooding or water shortages. You know, it's not just the temperatures changing. But for every degree Celsius the air temperature warms, the atmosphere can hold 7% more water, which is an incredible number. That means where water is available, you're going to have much more in the way of a waterlogged atmosphere and more flooding. Where water is not available, you're going to sap the ground of moisture and get more drought and more fire. And it's difficult for people to understand that both fire, droughts, and flooding can all be tied to the same phenomenon. But, you know, when the atmosphere's moisture holding capacity increases, we get precipitation extremes on both sides of the spectrum, and that will be a huge infrastructure huge infrastructure issue in the years ahead.
There's a final word on early warning systems, and again, we've seen them work well, and we've seen them fail dismally. Tell us about the role that they play in helping communities prepare and respond.
That's one thing we've really been struggling with in the United States, is that we have amazing forecasting abilities, we have amazing climate and weather monitoring, but the communications piece is the most difficult thing. Even if we issue the best weather warnings in the entire world, if people aren't acting on those warnings, or people have become complacent, or for whatever reason don't take the appropriate measures, then it's sort of not doing what it needs to do. And so I think in the future, it's going to be as much a social science issue as it is a meteorology and climate issue.
Right, good talking to you, Matthew. Meteorologist Matthew Capucci here in sweltering Berlin. Good to meet you.